Hi, I'm Nikki Sloan from Community Industry Group, coming to you today from the beautiful lands of the Dharawal people to bring you a very special episode of Community Matters, the podcast that explores issues that are impacting our community with the people who are making a difference. And today's a little bit different because today we're going to bring you the presentation by Matt Grudnoff from the Australia Institute, who's doing a presentation for us to celebrate World Social Justice Day. I hope you enjoy Matt's reflections on revenue and its impact on equality and human rights in our country.
You've chosen to have an economist come and talk to you, which you know, as Sir Humphrey might have said in Yes Minister, that was a courageous decision. But look, before your eyes glaze over, before you think, oh, an economist, this is going to be boring, I promise I will not be as boring as you think, which is a very low bar to get over, I admit. But what you won't see is any equations or demand and supply curves or Pareto optimal efficiencies or anything like that, any jargon. What I'm interested in is stories and to tell you what's happening, how we got here, and what we can do about it. Inequality. We all hear that it is getting worse, but is it actually getting worse? And if it is, why is it getting worse? And so to start that, what I want to talk about is something that economists are absolutely obsessed with, and everybody else is like, yeah, maybe, and that is economic growth, right? What is economic growth? Well, it basically just means the economy being able to make more stuff than it used to. So if the economy grows by 2, 3, 5% in a year, all that means is that we can now make 2, 3, 5% more than we could last year. And it also means we're earning 2, 3, 5% more income. Income's good, right? So economic growth must be good. Well, maybe. What it doesn't tell you anything about is who's getting the benefit of that economic growth, right? If we grow 5% in a year, that's a pretty good rate of growth. But if it's not being spread evenly, if it's just accruing to a small group of people, then most people are not going to feel any benefit from that economic growth. So what I did with a colleague of mine, David Richardson, was we had a look at who was getting the benefits from economic growth. All right, and we wanted to look over a long time scale. Okay, so what we did is we divided for the last 70 years, into 5 different time periods. And effectively, they're weird time periods. I do apologise. Basically, they are economic cycles, which I'm not going to go into. But basically, when a crisis happens, right, we waited until the next crisis happened and we took that as one period. Why? Because the economy does lots of different things. It grows quickly and then it goes into another crisis, and then it grows quickly and it goes into another crisis. And we wanted to capture all of that growth and that crisis, because different groups do well at different points in that cycle. So the first period we had was the 1950s, 1950 to 1960. And what we did is we split this benefits of this growth into the top 10% and the bottom 90%. Now I say bottom 90%, but it's like almost everybody, right? I remember watching a movie once and somebody was saying, I was in the top 70% of my class, which sounds impressive first time, and then you think about it and you go, so you were in the 30, you were, basically near the bottom. So when we say bottom 90%, it sounds like, oh, people down the bottom. No, that's almost everybody. Okay, so I basically split everybody up into the top 10% in one group and almost everybody else in the other group. Okay, and in the 1950s, golden age of economics, 96% of the benefits of growth went to the majority. Only 4% went to the top 10%. So, in fact, the top 10% did badly out of the 1950s. But before you feel sorry for them, things are going to change, all right? So let's go to the next period from 1961 to 82. So this ends with the 1980s recession. I don't remember that, but some people here might. 1960s to 82, the top 10% are now getting a slightly outsized lump. They're only getting 16%, but remember there's only 10% of them. They're getting 16% of the growth. The rest, 84%, is going to the rest of us, the other 90%. Then we go to the period between the 80s recession and the 1990s recession. I have vague memories of the 1990s recession. It changes dramatically. All right? It looks pretty even, doesn't it? But you got to remember that the top 10% is only 10%. They're getting almost half of all of the benefits from economic growth. Decade of greed, the 80s, all right? Maybe that's not unexpected, okay? Now let's go between the 1990s recession and the GFC. Things have improved a bit, all right? The bottom 10% are still getting an outsized benefit. They're getting over a third of the benefit, and the rest is going to the rest of us. We had the mining boom, there was strong wages growth, so perhaps not completely unexpected. And our final time period from the GFC to just before the pandemic struck in 2019. I saw that and I didn't believe it, right? We went back and checked this data so many times because it was really, really odd, right? So the top 10% over that period got 93% of the benefit. Only 7% went to the rest, the 90%. So when you think, is inequality getting worse? Yes, it is getting worse. Is the economy growing? Yeah, absolutely it's growing. But that benefit isn't flowing to everybody. It's flowing to a very small group. So the question is then why? Why did that happen? Well, this is actually a story of wages and profits. The bottom 90%, the sort of average people, earn most of their income from wages. Not all of them. If you're retired, obviously you're not earning income from wages. But most households who are of working age earn most of their income from wages. The top 10% are a little bit different. They earn most of their income from owning stuff, whether it's from capital gains, whether it's from owning shares and they get dividends, whether it's from owning businesses. They get most of their income from profits. All right? And what happened over that period is wages were really, really stagnant. You might remember that wages only grew at sort of about 2% or 2.5%, and inflation was like almost 2% or 2.5%. They were basically stagnant. All right? And because they were stagnant, there was very little flowing to the 90%. But at the same time, businesses continued to be very profitable. Right? Which means where was all the economic growth going? Well, it was going in the form of profits to the top 10%. All right? So what are the consequences of this high rates of inequality? What is the consequences of basically people, most of the economic growth, most of the benefit going to just a small group? Well, if we have a look, we can look at poverty rates in Australia. And now I'm comparing them to OECD countries, which is just rich countries, the developed countries in the world. Okay, there's about 35 of them, all right? And poverty rates for retired people, basically older people, aged over 65. Australia, you can see, is right near the top, all right? Australia is the ninth richest country in the world, in the OECD, the ninth highest income, but we have, what is it? 1, 2, 3, 4, fifth highest poverty rates for people over 65. And if we look at unemployment assistance replacement rate, very boring word. What does it mean? It's basically a way of comparing how much our unemployment benefits go to replacing a wage if somebody loses it. All right? And so it's a way of comparing how generous are our unemployment benefits compared to those of other countries. We're the least generous. The OECD, right average, right in the middle there, we are the worst in the world. The age pension replacement rate, okay, similar. The idea is how much does our age pension compared to average wages? Second lowest in the OECD. So we have these really, really high poverty rates. All right, so why? Why is Australia, which is a very, very rich country, why does it have these high rates of poverty? Why can't we do more? Well, you're probably told all the time, and I don't need to tell you, but you're probably told all the time that there isn't enough money to fund the work. You see the problem You're on the front line of the problem. You're trying to solve the problem. And I'm sure you're constantly told there isn't enough money to go around. That, oh, we've given out this year. We've had to focus on this other sector. Next time, you might get more. Hang in there. We know what you're doing is important. Absolutely what you're doing is important. We acknowledge what you're doing is important, but we don't have any money for it. Sorry. Okay? And so why is that the case? Well, it comes down to this. And this is what I want to talk about. Tax revenue by rich countries. What we see here is Australia is a low tax country. Yes, we are a very rich country, but we are also a low tax country. Now you might go, wait a minute, people pay a fair amount of tax, right? They are struggling. They're not doing well. They're scraping by. House prices are massive. They've got huge mortgages. They're paying big rents. Groceries cost money. We can't really afford to pay more tax. And if you look at Australia and you break it down into kind of low income, middle income and high income earners, low and middle income earners actually pay a more average rate of tax compared to other OECD countries. It's actually high income earners that are able to avoid paying tax in Australia. And so that's what I want to have a quick talk about. Just to give you an idea of how much money we're talking about. So these are percentages, 29.7%, 34.8% is the average. They're a bit meaningless. If Australia was just average, all right, not a high taxing country, but basically had 34.8% of its GDP in tax, just dead on the average, we would collect an additional $130 billion a year in tax. $130 billion a year in tax. What could you guys do with $130 billion of extra revenue? What good could you do with $130 billion? And that doesn't make us a high tax country. That just stops us being a low tax country. How can we tax more? So it's all well and good to say, we should collect more tax. The really tricky political question that I'm sure our politicians would want to talk about or want to know the answer to is how can we raise more revenue? Because that's a really tricky political problem. And if low and middle income earners are struggling and are paying a reasonable amount of tax, how do we tax high income earners? Well, I sat down yesterday and I basically went through and I thought of a few ideas that we'd done research on, and I came up with $110 billion a year. All right? The top of the list is a 25% tax on gas exports. Right? We don't tax our resources sector very well at all. If you look at Norway, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, big exporters of gas and oil, they get an enormous amount of revenue from it. In fact, Qatar exports about the same amount of gas as Australia. They get 8 times as much revenue, 8 times as much revenue from their gas, the government does, in Qatar than we do in Australia. If we put a 25% tax on gas exports, the first thing is if the companies wanted to sell gas to Australians, they wouldn't pay the tax. All right, so it's not going to affect the price of gas in Australia. It's only a tax if you want to sell it overseas. That would raise $17 billion. All right. Another one, a 2% annual wealth tax on assets above 5 million. So we're talking about people in the top 5% of wealth holders, the very, very top. Forget the top 10%. This is the top 5%. And even if you excluded from that tax family homes and superannuation balances of those people with more than $5 million, it would still raise $70 billion a year. Reform superannuation tax concessions. Superannuation tax concessions, right? Another thing that probably makes your eyes glaze over, were basically put in place to encourage people to save in retirement. If people have their own savings in retirement, then they don't rely on the age pension as much and the government as much. That's a good thing. So we'll tax them less if they put their money into their super, right? Unfortunately, huge amounts of the super tax concessions, 50% of it, go to people who would never be on an age pension, even if we tax them at the full rate. These are very wealthy people with huge balances that are never, ever, ever going to be on an age pension. And so why do we give them an incentive to save more And also, why would they save more? There are people out there with $500 million in their super account. I would argue, if you've got $500 million in your super account, you're not saving for your retirement anymore. You're dodging tax, right? And good on the Labor government for bringing in reforms to people with balances over 3 million and over 10 million. They're reducing the tax concession, effectively increasing the amount of tax that people with huge balances have. But we could go further than that, and we could easily raise another 10 billion, just targeting those at the very top. Reform capital gains tax and negative gearing, that's a good idea even if it raised no revenue. That will make housing more affordable. That will stop us speculating on housing. That will move us away from the world that John Howard created when he said housing isn't about a safe and secure place to live. It's actually an investment. It's a way to build a nest egg, right? We used to think of housing as a safe and secure place to live, a place to raise a family. Now it's become a way to make money, right? There are plenty of ways people can make money. I'm an economist. I like investment, right? Investment is a good thing. But, right, you shouldn't be investing in things that make other people worse off. You can invest in the stock market, the bond market. You can get into all kinds of different investments. Let's stop beating first home buyers out of the market, pushing up house prices just so that we can make a bit of money. Put your money in something else. There's plenty of things you can put it in. Those together would get us to 110 billion, which is not the 100, which would still make us below average, but 110 billion of extra revenue would go a long, long way to helping Australia fund the social services and fund the society we need. And so, why is this important? Well, if you're involved in aged care, you probably need to have an interest in capital gains tax. If you are involved in helping the homeless, you probably need to understand superannuation tax concessions. If you're involved in community services, you probably need to be thinking about wealth taxes. It might seem counterintuitive, but if you want the pie to grow, if you want the revenue to be there to be able to fund those services, right, fighting amongst yourself or being played off against each other by saying, oh, we gave more to aged care in this budget, so the homeless can't get as much. Or, child care got a big increase, so, I'm afraid you're going to miss out. Well, it doesn't have to be. It's only that way in a rich country like Australia because we are a low tax country. We can have more and we don't have to fight amongst ourselves, but unfortunately it means advocating for these kind of things. Often in economics, we're told we have to do something because it's good for the economy. We have to do something because if we don't, then the economy will do badly and everybody will do badly. The economy sometimes feels like one of those good old-fashioned gods that you need to sacrifice to in order to get a good harvest, right? The economy is all of us. The economy is what we create, right? And the economy doesn't exist for us to serve it. The economy exists to serve us, right? And we need to remember that. A lot of the choices that are put to us and say, well, we have to do this, aren't choices about what we have to do. They're moral choices dressed up as things that must be done in order to keep the economy happy. And, the famous saying was, tax is the price you pay to live in a civilised country. Well, at the moment, Australia perhaps needs to think about how much tax it's paying and whether it's paying a high enough price to get as much civilisation as it wants. Being annoyed at something is a great motivator to work. I'm sure you've experienced this too, but years ago when Tony Abbott was Prime Minister, he used to go around saying that no country taxed itself to prosperity, that tax is a wet blanket on economic growth, right? And that annoyed me as an economist because I knew it was garbage. And then I went around and I started looking to see who'd done research into, well, has anybody looked into this? And nobody had, so I decided, well, I would give it a go. And then I realised why nobody had done it. When you try to get data on all the countries in the world on their tax and their average income. Average income is basically average GDP. So economies that grow quickly will have higher incomes. They'll be richer. And so eventually I kind of put all the data together, and I've just pulled out one of the graphs from this, which is just the developed countries. And what we see here is how much a country taxes. We call it tax to GDP ratio, but basically how much of that income of the total income in the country is paid in tax, and average income down the bottom, GDP per person. And we can see a lovely upward correlation. So what does that mean? It means that countries with higher tax rates tend to have higher incomes. Now, it's really important to say that's a correlation, not a causation. Doesn't mean that taxation causes higher incomes or higher incomes causes higher taxes. But what it does show is that Tony Abbott and all those people who say that tax is a drag on the economy are wrong, right? Otherwise, the correlation would be in entirely the opposite direction, right? Higher tax countries would be poorer. Because why? Because they grow slower, because taxes are a drain on the economy. But what we actually see is the opposite. And if you look where Australia is, right, we're near the bottom, okay, down here, because we're a low tax country. Sure, Costa Rica, Turkey, Chile, Colombia, they all have lower taxes. There are a couple of countries that kind of have higher incomes and lower taxes. And we've got Ireland, Switzerland, and the United States. Ireland and Switzerland are tax havens, right? In fact, Ireland's GDP is so distorted by the fact that it's a tax haven that the government ordered their version of the Australian Bureau of Statistics, their national stats organisation, to come up with a new calculation of GDP because it was so wrecking what it was. So basically in Ireland, it has Meta, Google, they're all basically headquartered in Ireland. All their employees don't live there, their CEO doesn't live there, but there's a building there with headquarters, Meta, somewhere in Ireland, in a special tax geographic location. It has all of this money that flows through it that doesn't benefit the Irish people in any way, but basically just flows through it. And so that massively inflates its GDP. So if you look at Ireland without that, it falls back into the other. And Switzerland's the same, it's another tax haven. The United States, look, yeah, United States is a weird country, all right? In many ways, but economically, it is. It's odd. But you know, if you wanna make the argument that we should be more like the US, go ahead. You know, go ahead. But otherwise, right, there are basically no countries that Australia would be like to be more like that are lower tax than us. Right? We actually do really, really well with the amount of tax we collect. The problem isn't that we're not efficient enough. The problem isn't that we waste our money. The problem is we don't collect enough of it. Right? And if we want we want a more civilized society, we have to pay more tax.